December 1944, near Aachen, German POWs thought they'd face starvation. I was a soldier in the 12th Volksgrenadier Division. I expected a rifle butt, maybe worse. My hands were frostbitten, my rifle was gone. Then an American guard offered me a cigarette. We arrived at a camp that smelled not of death, but of frying meat. The Geneva Convention demanded they feed us, but no rule demanded steak and apple pie. This was an act of mercy so unexpected it would become a secret, buried in shame for decades after the war. If your enemy feeds you better than your own family, how do you ever go home and tell the truth? Please share your city and local time in the comments. We want to see how far these testimonies travel. If acts of decency in wartime matter, subscribe to ensure they are never forgotten. In the biting cold of December 1944, a line of grey figures trudged through the snows of the Ardennes. They were the defeated remnants of Germany's 12th Volksgrenadier Division, captured in the forests outside a shattered village near Aachen. The youngest among them, a boy of 19 named Karl Müller, kept his head down, the wind burning his ears. His stomach was a tight, aching knot, but it was a familiar ache. Hunger had been his companion for weeks. Now, he expected it to become his executioner. The stories they had all been told circled in his mind, whispers passed down from officers and repeated in the bunkers. The Americans, they said, were savages. They were godless mongrels who took no real prisoners. Surrender, the radio broadcasts had warned, meant a slow, deliberate death by starvation. It was a terror that felt more real than the frostbite numbing his fingers and toes. He remembered the moment of his capture just hours before. The world had dissolved into noise, confusion, and the terrifying sight of American soldiers emerging from the trees, their faces hard and unfamiliar. He had dropped his rifle, his hands shaking as he raised them above his head. For a long second, he had braced for the shot. He had seen it happen before, but the shot never came. An American military policeman from the 99th Infantry Division's rear guard had simply waved him forward with the barrel of his own rifle. The march westward was a silent, shuffling ordeal. Karl watched the backs of the men in front of him, each step a small victory against the crushing exhaustion. He focused on the words of the sergeants back in training, the stark warnings about the enemy's cruelty. They would be humiliated, worked until they collapsed, and fed just enough to prolong the misery. He believed it completely. It was the only truth he knew. Why would his own leaders lie? Then, something happened that made no sense. The American MP walking alongside the column paused. He saw Karl stumble, catching himself against a tree. The man was big, his uniform thick and warm against the winter air. He reached into his coat, and for a heartbeat, Karl flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, the American pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He shook one out, lit it, and with a small, almost tired gesture, held it out to Karl. The boy stared, confused. A cigarette? Not a shove, not a curse, not the butt of a rifle, but a small, impossible courtesy. He took it with trembling fingers, the warmth of the tip, a strange comfort against his frozen skin. It was the first crack in the wall of his fear. It was a gesture that did not fit the story of monsters he had been told. He smoked it down to the filter, the simple act feeling like a betrayal of the hatred he was supposed to feel. As dusk settled, they were led into a clearing surrounded by barbed wire. It was a temporary holding pen. Mud and snow churned into a bleak slurry under their feet. This, Karl thought, is where it begins. The starvation. But then a smell drifted on the wind, something that cut through the cold and the scent of damp wool and fear. It was warm, savory, and utterly out of place. It was the smell of cooking food, not thin, watery soup, but something rich. It was meat. Other prisoners smelled it too. Heads lifted. Men exchanged confused, hopeful glances. From a series of large tents, steam rose into the frigid air. They could see American soldiers moving inside, organized and efficient. No one was shouting. No one was jeering. There were just tin cups, hundreds of them, lined up on long wooden tables. A soldier next to Karl whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief, "It smells like beef. Can't be. It can't be for us." They were herded into a line that moved slowly but steadily toward one of the mess tents. Karl's heart pounded, a mixture of hope and suspicion. Perhaps it was a trick, a final, cruel joke before the end. When his turn came, an American mess sergeant, a burly man with a tired face, slapped a scoop of mashed potatoes onto a metal tray. Next to it, he placed a thick slice of what looked like meatloaf, covered in a dark gravy. Another soldier handed him a tin cup filled with steaming black coffee. Carl took the tray, his hands unsteady. It was heavy. It was real. He found a place on a wooden bench, the men around him eating in a stunned, near-total silence. There was only the sound of spoons scraping against metal. He looked down at his tray. The food was not just sustenance. It was a meal. A proper meal, like one his mother would have made before the war, before the rations dwindled to nothing. He took his first bite of the meatloaf. It was warm. The flavor filled his mouth, chasing away the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. The heat spread through his chest, a comforting burn against the years of cold. The potatoes were real, not the powdered kind he was used to. It was more food than he had eaten in a month. He ate slowly, then faster, suddenly terrified it would be taken away. He watched the American guards. They stood at the edges of the encampment, rifles held loosely, observing the prisoners with a detached, almost bored professionalism. They were not monsters. They were just men doing a job. And part of that job, it seemed, was to feed their enemies. As he finished the last of the potatoes, a thought came to him, clear and sharp as a shard of ice. It was a thought so heavy, so revolutionary, that it scared him more than the threat of starvation ever had. Everything I was told, he realized, cannot be true. The journey from the muddy fields of Germany to the heart of America was a disorienting blur of trains and the vast, unsettling emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. By the spring of 1945, Carl Mueller found himself behind another wire fence, but this one was different. He was in Camp Swift, Texas. The ground was not frozen mud but dry, dusty earth that baked under a sun far hotter than any he had ever known. The air was thick with the scent of pine and unfamiliar blossoms. Here, the guards were just as professional, the routines just as strict, but the persistent fear of starvation had been replaced by a quiet, gnawing confusion. The food was plentiful, consistent, and better than anything he had eaten even before the war began. It was a reality so contrary to the myths he'd been raised on that it felt like a dream. The real shock, the moment that would redefine his captivity, came not on a special occasion, but on an ordinary Sunday. The prisoners were marched to the mess hall, the same as every other day. But the smell was different, richer. When Carl reached the front of the line, the mess sergeant, a gruff but fair man from Kansas, named Bill Rogers, didn't serve stew. He placed a grilled piece of beef on Carl's tray. It was a steak. Next to it went a scoop of potatoes and a slice of apple pie. Carl sat on the bench, staring at his plate. Steak and pie. This was not food for survival. This was a feast. He and the men around him ate in a state of stunned reverence. This simple meal was an act of profound and baffling dignity. He saw a young American corporal guarding the door, shake his head, a wry smile on his face. The corporal knew, as many of them did, the deep irony of the situation. Back home, his own mother in Ohio was using ration books. Sugar, meat, and coffee were precious commodities for American civilians. Yet here, in the middle of Texas, captured enemy soldiers were eating steak. Carl later found a German officer, a man who kept a secret diary, scribbling away in a corner. The man looked up, his eyes filled with a complicated emotion that was part gratitude, part shame. He whispered, "We sat stunned. The Americans gave us meat, potatoes, even apple pie. At home, my mother writes that she boils weeds for soup. This wasn't an accident or a moment of random kindness. It was policy." The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention, an international agreement with a clear and simple rule regarding prisoners of war. They must receive the same quality and quantity of food as the detaining power's own base troops. American command insisted on following this rule to the letter, hoping it might encourage the Germans to treat captured Americans with similar decency. By the middle of 1945, the U.S. was applying this policy to nearly 370,000 German prisoners held in camps spread across 46 states. It was a massive, deliberate act of adherence to law over vengeance. As the months passed, Carl was sent with a labor detail to a farm in Nebraska. The work was hard, picking sugar beets under the summer sun, but it was honest. For their labor, the prisoners were paid in scrip, a special camp currency they could use at a small canteen to buy small luxuries: soap, a chocolate bar, or extra tobacco. From the fields, they could see the lives of ordinary Americans unfolding. They saw families driving cars on paved roads. On Sundays, they heard church bells ringing from a nearby town, a peaceful, melodic sound that felt like it belonged to another world. He watched children eating ice cream cones on a sunny afternoon. An older prisoner, a cynical sergeant from Hamburg, muttered under his breath, "We were told America was collapsing under Jewish control, that the people were starving and decadent. But these people look free. They look well fed." It was a constant, daily dismantling of a lifetime of propaganda. The Nazi radio broadcasts he had grown up with had painted a terrifying picture. "The Anglo-American plutocrats will starve your sons," the announcers had declared with absolute certainty. The reality was the exact opposite. US Army doctors in the camps kept meticulous records. They noted that the average caloric intake for a German POW was around 3,200 calories a day. Far from starving, most prisoners gained weight during their time in America, some as much as 10 or 15 kilos. The enemy, it turned out, was not the monster from the radio. The enemy followed rules. The enemy served pie. One night, unable to sleep, Carl found a scrap of toilet paper and the stub of a pencil. In the quiet of the barracks, surrounded by the soft breathing of other sleeping prisoners, he wrote down the thought that had been chasing him for months. "I dreamed of bread and woke to steak. The war inside my head is harder now." The strange, inverted reality of captivity continued as Carl was transferred once again, this time to the humid summer of Georgia. There, he and other prisoners were put to work in vast fields picking cotton or felling trees in sprawling pine forests. The labor was demanding, but the routine was predictable, and the food was always there. A dark joke began to circulate among the men. A whispered observation passed in German when the American guards were out of earshot. They would say, with a bitter irony, that they were living better in enemy hands than they had as soldiers in their own army. For a while, it was a joke that helped them cope. But then the letters from home began to arrive more frequently. Each letter was a small, treasured link to a world that felt impossibly far away. They were heavily censored, of course, with thick black lines striking out any mention of troop movements, strategic locations, or anything that could be considered military intelligence. Yet, what the censors left in was often more devastating than what they removed. Karl's mother, Frau Müller, wrote from Cologne. She never complained directly, for that would not pass the censors, but the truth bled through the edges of her careful words. She wrote about the garden, about how resourceful one had to be. She mentioned boiling turnips for the third night in a row. She spoke of the long queues for a single loaf of bread, of mending the same pair of shoes for her younger children until there was more patch than leather. While Karl was gaining weight on a steady diet of meat, bread, and vegetables, his family was slowly starving. The quiet guilt that had been a small seed in his mind began to grow, twisting around his conscience. He was safe, he was fed, and they were not. This stark contrast was not just a personal tragedy felt by Karl and his family. It was the reality across all of Germany. By late 1944 and into 1945, the war had come home with a vengeance. Allied bombing had turned cities like Hamburg and Cologne into vast landscapes of rubble. Civilian rations, meticulously documented by the collapsing government, had plummeted below 1,500 calories a day. For many, it was far less. Survival became a daily, exhausting struggle for a handful of potatoes or a few ounces of bread. While Karl sat down to 3 meals a day, his mother stood in a line, hoping for scraps. One evening in the early spring of 1945, a new batch of prisoners arrived at the camp in Georgia, bringing with them news from the front. They spoke in hushed, horrified tones of the firebombing of Dresden. The news spread through the barracks like a fever. It was a city of refugees, they said, a city of culture, now erased from the earth. The carefully constructed discipline of the camp momentarily fractured. That night in the mess hall, the men were served cornbread and stew. One prisoner, a young man from Saxony, whose entire family lived in Dresden, simply broke down. He began to sob uncontrollably, his tears falling onto his tray. Another man nearby, older and stoic, pushed his slice of pie away. "My sister is probably dead," he said to no one in particular, his voice hollow. "Why should I eat this?" The American guards watched, uncertain. This was a grief their rulebook had no answer for. They let the man fast, but a few of his fellow prisoners gently pressed the pie back into his hand, an unspoken plea for him to hold on. Karl felt a cold dread wash over him. He was a survivor, But what kind of survival was this? To grow strong while your world burned down. Years passed. The war ended. In 1947, Karl was finally repatriated, sent back to a country he barely recognized. He arrived in Cologne to find skeletons of buildings reaching toward a grey sky. The air still smelled of dust and damp decay. He found his mother and younger siblings living in the cellar of their bombed-out apartment building. Frau Müller had aged 20 years. She was thin, her face etched with lines of exhaustion and grief, but her eyes were as stern and resilient as ever. She embraced him, a fierce, bony hug that spoke of both love and pain. In the dim, cold room, she served him soup. It was thin, made from potatoes and whatever greens she had managed to find. As he ate, he tried to tell her about his time in America. He wanted to explain why he looked healthy, why his clothes, though worn, were not rags. He wanted to share the strange, unbelievable truth of his experience. It was not what we were told. He began hesitantly. They fed us well. He searched for an example, a concrete detail to make her understand. They gave us pie. His mother stopped stirring the pot on the small stove. She turned to him, her face a mask of disbelief that quickly hardened into anger. Her voice was a low, wounded whisper. Pie? While we boiled nettles? While your sister cried from hunger? She turned away from him, her back rigid. Never speak of this again. In that moment, the mercy he had been shown became a source of shame. The kindness felt like a betrayal. His mother's words built a wall of silence around his memory, and he began to wonder if the steak and pie had been real at all, or just a cruel and beautiful dream he had imagined in his hunger. For decades after his return, Karl Müller lived with the silence his mother had commanded. The memory of the food, of the impossible kindness, became a private, guarded thing. He learned, as many former prisoners did, that it was a story few at home wanted to hear. The national narrative was one of shared suffering, of rubble, and of hunger. To speak of being well-fed in an enemy camp sounded like a boast, or worse, a betrayal. Admitting to the enemy's decency felt like an indictment of one's own side, and so, a cultural silence took hold. The generation of men who had been prisoners in America learned to say simply, it was difficult, leaving the details buried. They carried the truth of the steak and the pie like a secret treasure, one that was too heavy and too bright to show to those who had endured only darkness. The war inside Karl's head, the one he had written about on a scrap of paper in a Texas barracks, never truly ended. It just went quiet. Then, more than 40 years later, when Karl was an old man with grandchildren of his own, a young oral historian came to his small apartment in a rebuilt Cologne. She sat patiently in his living room, a tape recorder on the table between them, her questions gentle and direct. She asked about his capture, about the camps, about the journey home. He spoke of the cold, the fear, and the confusion, the stories he had told 100 times. But when she asked about the food, he hesitated. The silence stretched. The old shame, the echo of his mother's wounded voice, rose in him. He looked at his hands, knotted with age, and saw the frostbitten fingers of a 19-year-old boy. He finally looked at the historian, his eyes watering. His voice, when it came, was a soft, cracking whisper. I never starved, he confessed, the words feeling like a weight lifting off his chest after a lifetime. I never froze. The Americans, they fed us like men. He paused, took a ragged breath, the gratitude and the guilt still fighting their long war inside him. The historian did not look surprised. She simply nodded, understanding the conflict he had carried for so long. She then offered him the one thing he had never had: context. She presented him not with judgment, but with facts. She explained that his experience was not an anomaly, it was the standard. She spoke of the meticulous records kept by the US Army. Cooks across the American camp system had served over 2.5 million meals to German prisoners every single day. She showed him charts documenting that most POWs, far from starving, had gained between 10 and 15 kilos during their captivity. This abundance, she explained, was not an accident of surplus. It was a deliberate policy, a strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, an act of principled discipline from the highest levels of command down to the mess sergeants who cooked the meals. For the first time, Karl saw his memory not as a strange fluke, but as part of a massive, documented reality. The kindness was not random, it was systematic. In that quiet living room, surrounded by photographs of a life lived after the war, Karl Mueller finally understood. The honor he had been taught as a young soldier was about dying for a cause, about hardness and sacrifice. He now realized there was another kind of honor, a different kind of strength. It was the strength of restraint. It was the discipline to treat a defeated and hated enemy with dignity, not because they deserved it, but because your own rules demanded it. The act of serving steak and pie to the enemy was not a sign of American weakness, as his old officers would have claimed. It was an expression of their power, a power so secure that it did not need to be cruel. The shame he had carried for so long finally dissolved, replaced by a profound and quiet sense of clarity. He closed his eyes, and the memory he had suppressed for so long returned to him, clear and bright. He was 19 again, sitting in the Texas heat, holding a metal tray. He could smell the cinnamon. He could feel the warmth of the apple pie on his tongue. It was the shock of it, the unexpected taste of mercy, in a world that had taught him only to expect brutality. He opened his eyes and looked at the historian. "I expected to starve," he said, his voice finally steady and clear. "Instead, they gave me pie, and I have never forgotten what mercy tastes like."